Hello, everybody. Welcome to a series of global dialogues on global history at Tokyo College. I am the director of Tokyo College, Haneda Masashi, and today's moderator. Today we have a special guest, namely Professor Sebastian Conrad of Berlin Free University. I don't need to introduce, I believe that I don't need to introduce him in detail because he's one of the greatest leaders of the world on global history with the publication of this book, What is Global History, which was published in 2016, I think. And so we are very keen to discuss especially today, politics and global history with him. But at the same time, I want to underline that he has had a close relation with Japan, with the University of Tokyo in particular, because he stayed in Institute of Social Science in 1998 or 98, I can't remember the precise date, but exact date, but anyway, stayed a whole year before submitting his doctoral thesis to his own university. And his doctoral thesis was published later with the title, The Quest for the Lost Nation, Writing History in Germany and Japan in the American Century. That means he is very good at speaking and hearing Japanese, but today we will discuss everything in English. And the title of today's session is Politics of Global History. This is the title Professor Conrad himself proposed us. So I'm sure he has a lot of things to discuss on this. And with me today at Tokyo College, I have TERADA Yuki, a project researcher who is working in the field of the history of the museum in Iran. And she will ask questions to Professor Conrad, and then we'll start to discuss.
Thank you for your introduction, and nice to see you again, Professor Conrad. I'd like to ask you two basic questions first. Well, actually, because you are the leading expert of global history, and then you published that book in 2016. So could you briefly introduce what is global history by your definition for those who are not familiar with this subject? And also, I'd like to know why you are particularly paying attention to populism with regard to today's discussion.
Thank you both for the introduction and for having me in this format. Yeah, thanks for the question, Yuki. So global history, you know, in a very general way, can be understood as the way to think about history and the past in our global age, which means that, you know, if we think about history as we've learned it in school and also as it's usually taught in the university, this is really a discipline that had emerged in the 19th century. And in the 19th century, it was shaped by the particular circumstances of that time. In the 19th century, history emerged in very close alliance with the nation state. Historians wrote the history usually of their own nations. The nations were the main subject of these histories. This is one. And second, it emerged at a time that was, you know, around the world dominated by imperialism. This was the high time of European, but then also later also Japanese imperialism. And this political order entered history as a discipline as well, in the shape of Eurocentrism. So I sometimes call these two aspects the birth defects of the discipline of history as it emerged in the 19th century: close alliance with the nation state and Eurocentrism. And in schools, but also in the universities, to a large extent, we still operate with this old discipline of history, even though our world has dramatically changed. So in its, you know, in the most general description of global history would be to say, we need to rethink the discipline of history to make sense in a global context. And this means primarily to focus on connections, on interactions, and on the way in which the globe has gradually come together, has gradually been integrated into one. This is for your first question. The second one on populism. So let me say that, sometimes, so populism as a global wave has emerged over the past few years, right? It has a bit of a longer history, but really as a global phenomenon, we look at it as having appeared maybe 5 years ago. And it's sometimes seen as the opposite of global history, sometimes seen as the end even of global history. But I don't think that is the right conclusion to be drawn. In fact, quite on the contrary, I think global historians have it's one of the tasks of global historians to, on the one hand, counter this trend of populism, but also, on the other hand, to actually explain it better, right? I mean, how is it possible to think about populism on a global scale today without actually recognizing that there are certain patterns, right? These are not movements that simply emerge out of their own nations, in Hungary, in the Philippines, in the United States, but there is something that they share. And therefore, I think it's much easier for us to really understand the rise of populism if we actually look at it as a global phenomenon that's not limited to a particular country, or the rise of one particular populist figure like Trump or Duterte or Orban or Modi and so forth. So therefore, ultimately, the age of populism may look like an age where it's difficult to do global history, and to some extent that's true, but it is an age where global history is needed more than ever.
I just wanted to clarify, when you say integration, could you explain if the history of globalization is different from the global history of integration?
Well, yes. So sometimes the term globalization is a tricky one. Some people associate it with the 1990s and the time since then. Other people look at it as a very long process that reaches back into the 19th century, sometimes even the 16th century. What I mean by global integration, in some ways, is similar, I would say, to globalization. Essentially, I mean that the main dynamics of how a society changes is not limited to that society, but is linked to other societies. If we look at economics, a very, simple way to look at it would be to say that gradually, for example, prices and wages in one place converge with prices and wages elsewhere. As we see a world market emerging, we realize that, that silver in one place has a similar price than silver in another. But increasingly, this is also something that shapes social development, shapes cultural development. So that's what I mean when I say integration.
Can I intervene a little bit your discussion? According to you, Sebastian, is it possible for us to write a global history of medieval age, for example, or antiquity? Because you put importance on the integration or connection. In this respect, how we can imagine the global history of the Middle Age or antiquity?
So thanks for that question. So first of all, there are so many different global histories or variations of world history out there. So I cannot speak for all of them. Some of them are mainly content with comparing different parts of the world. And that's also an interesting and maybe important project. Of course, and if we compare, then we can go back all the way. We can compare the rise of the first city-states in the Americas and in the Indus Valley. This would not be a problem, even though it's clear that these two processes were not linked at all. My own understanding of global history is a somewhat more narrow, or more, I would say, a more ambitious project, where I think that in order to arrive at a sort of global history perspective, we need to think about causality on a global level. And therefore, this requires that there is some form of integration that actually is palpable and has an impact on other societies. How far can we go back when we think about global history in this way? Well, it's clear that the further we go back in time, the more challenging it is to establish these kinds of causalities. But it's also clear that if, reaching back into the early modern period, for example, even into the medieval period, we certainly can establish such connections. We need only to think about the Mongol Empire and the way in which it linked various parts of Eurasia really for the first time, and made it possible to create cultural connections. People started to read texts in other languages that had not been available for a long time. So yes, in principle, I think we can go back, even though the purchase of global history as a method is much harder to sustain the further we go back.
Shall I continue to ask you one very interesting example? That is Japanese history. As you know it quite well, Japanese past has been influenced largely by China and Chinese culture. In this respect, Japan was, in a sense, integrated into Chinese world order, even, for example, in the 6th or 7th century. Can I call that phenomena global history?
I think in principle we can. I mean, it's important to recognize that some of the things that we call global history, we could also just simply call them history, except for the fact that for a long time our national perspectives have excluded some of these aspects from the way in which we understood the past. So to some extent, it's really about bringing back these connections that were out there before, for example, Japan as a nation state really emerged, right? Now, is this a form of global history? I would say yes. The larger Chinese civilization, or the Sinosphere, as it's sometimes called, which included obviously not only Japan and Korea and also Annam, but also many other entities. This was in some ways a world with connections, with forms of structured exchange, and absolutely. So I would think this would be one instance.
Yuki, please continue.
To come back to our present situation, I'd like to ask you about your view of reinterpretation of history, because the world surrounding us and the political circumstance obviously influence the ways in which historians think and approach the past. So, but we have to be also careful about how can one interpret the past without being revisionist or recreating something new or not correct or something like that. Do you have any views on this?
Yeah, thank you. So on the one hand, I mean, in general, I would first say that global history is a particular perspective. It's an approach. Sometimes people call it a method or a theory. But it doesn't mean that it comes with a specific form of politics, right? Depending on the historian, it can be linked to different forms of politics. But when you say revisionism, revisionist perspectives can be very healthy and important. But what I sense you're saying here is the kind of revisionism that we see happening in, let's say, countries like India today, in Turkey, Russia, and other places where it's really a form of nationalism that re-emerges, including grand claims, exaggerated claims that are very difficult to really sustain. So, for example, in India, where we see a movement towards increasingly excluding Muslim perspectives and Muslim actors from a national history that really essentially focuses on Hindus. Putin's recent attempts to write a history of Russia and the Soviet Union that is really very Russia-centric. So this kind of revisionism is I think what you probably, at least that's what I understand you having in mind. And here I think that global history is really the best antidote. It is really the best strategy to counter these claims with its inherent focus on interactions and exchange. It really is I think a very effective and productive strategy to counter narratives of my country firstism that we see now emerging in this age of populism.
We have just a couple of minutes, so please go ahead.
Okay, because you just mentioned the strategies, I think it's a very interesting point, because global historians in general have been attempting to sort of counter the view of nationalist historiography. So would we be possibly write the history for all human beings in the world? Or is it your vision is more fragmented or divided?
Yeah, well, so as I mentioned, I think global history comes with different politics, so we can only ask one specific historian, like I could ask you, or you could ask me about our own particular politics. That said, I do think there is a larger task for global history out there. I mean, this task may have shifted. So when global history began and emerged as a field in the early 2000s, it was really very closely linked to this process of globalization, right? The Cold War had ended. Everybody began to talk about globalization, and global historians wrote about this process, sometimes in an almost celebratory fashion, right? They praise this process of globalization without thinking about the costs and the limits and the problems that also went with it. But then increasingly, they understood themselves as scholars who critically accompanied this process. Now, in the age of Brexit and Orban, Duterte, and so forth, I think the task of global historians has shifted, and now the emphasis will be much more on the openness of borders, the way in which we actually look back to a long history of people migrating, cross-fertilizing different societies. So in that respect, I think there's clearly a political project out there for all of us.
We'll have another opportunity to discuss Eurocentrism with Sebastian Conrad in this series. He is kind enough to accept 2 apparitions on the screen. So thank you, Sebastian, today, and see you later soon.